What if the thing keeping you broke isn't your circumstances? What if it's something happening inside your brain right now as you watch this that was specifically designed to make sure you never actually build anything? Here's something that should bother you. The same neurological mechanism that drives a rat to press a lever 700 times for a single food pellet is the same mechanism firing in your brain every time you open TikTok, every time you check your phone for a notification that isn't there, every time you reload that same feed. You already know something is wrong. You feel it, that gnawing sense that you're capable of more than what you're producing, that gap between who you are and who you know you could be. But what if that gap isn't about discipline? What if it isn't about your background, your resources, your city, your family? What if the answer is far more disturbing than that? What if the most dangerous thing happening to young African men right now isn't poverty, it isn't unemployment, it isn't tribalism or bad governance or corrupt institutions, as real as all of those are? What if the most dangerous thing is something invisible, something that fits in your pocket, something you chose to bring into your life, something that is quietly, methodically, scientifically dismantling your ability to want hard things? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're not going to see your phone the same way again. Let's go back to 1953. A neuroscientist named James Olds was running experiments at McGill University in Canada. He was studying the brain's response to electrical stimulation, and by accident, he discovered something that would change everything we thought we knew about motivation, pleasure, and human behavior. He implanted tiny electrodes into the brains of rats, specifically into a region we now call the nucleus accumbens, deep in the limbic system. Then he let the rats control the stimulation themselves by pressing a lever. And what happened next genuinely disturbed the scientific community. The rats wouldn't stop pressing. They pressed the lever 7,000 times per hour. They ignored food, they ignored water, they ignored other rats. They pressed until they collapsed from exhaustion. And when Olds put the lever in between the rat and a piece of food, they chose the lever. They chose the feeling of wanting over the thing they actually needed. Now here's what most people get wrong about this experiment. Most people assume those rats were experiencing intense pleasure, like they were in a state of bliss. But that's not what was happening. And this is the part that should shake something loose in you. What Olds had accidentally discovered wasn't the pleasure circuit. He found the wanting circuit, the dopamine system. And dopamine, as neuroscientist Kent Berridge from the University of Michigan spent decades proving, is not about pleasure. Dopamine is about anticipation, about craving, about the feeling right before you get the thing, not the feeling of having it. The rats weren't happy. They were trapped in a loop of wanting that never resolved into satisfaction. Sound familiar? Think about what you actually feel when you scroll, not what you tell yourself you feel. What you actually feel. You're not satisfied. You're not relaxed. You're hunting. You're looking for something, though you couldn't name what it is. And every few seconds, your brain gets a tiny spike of dopamine, just enough to keep you hunting, never enough to make you feel full. That's the trap, not the content, the mechanism. And here's where this stops being about rats and starts being specifically, painfully about young African men in 2025. Because I want you to understand something that doesn't get talked about enough. The dopamine trap doesn't hit everyone equally. It is most devastating to people who have the most to build. And right now, there is no demographic on Earth with more to build, more fire in their bones, more hunger in their chest than young Africans between 18 and 35. You are the most entrepreneurially aspirational generation Africa has ever produced. Surveys consistently show that young Africans have some of the highest rates of entrepreneurial intent in the world. You grew up watching the world through a screen, knowing exactly what's possible, wanting it badly. You have access to information your grandfather could only dream of, and the algorithm knows that. Here's what I mean. The business model of every major social platform is not to entertain you. It is not to connect you. It is to maximize what Silicon Valley engineers call time on site. And the most effective way to do that is to exploit your dopamine system, to create deliberately the same lever-pressing loop that destroyed those rats. And they are extraordinarily good at it. In his book, Hooked, product designer Nir Eyal, who later became one of the most prominent critics of what he built, describes exactly how these systems are engineered. Variable reward schedules, which is the same mechanism that makes slot machines the most addictive gambling device ever created. Scroll feeds that deliver unpredictable bursts of interesting content. Notification systems designed to create anxiety in your absence. Social validation metrics like likes and comments calibrated to trigger your need for belonging. Every one of these is a lever, and every time you press it, your wanting system fires, and you never get full. But here's the part that really matters for you specifically. Here's the part that should make you angry. Dopamine doesn't just drive craving, it drives learning. Your brain uses dopamine to mark experiences as important, as worth repeating, as worth working toward. This is how humans developed motivation to do hard things. The anticipation of reward is what gave your ancestors the drive to hunt, to build, to plan across seasons, to sacrifice today for tomorrow. When you chronically overstimulate your dopamine system with cheap, effortless, instantly gratifying content, you don't just become addicted to the phone, you change the baseline. You recalibrate what your brain considers worth wanting. And suddenly, the slow, grinding, unsexy work of actually building something real, starting a business, learning a skill, writing a difficult book, having a hard conversation, writing the thing, building the thing, shipping the thing, that stuff stops feeling like opportunity. It starts feeling like punishment. I want to tell you about a young man. I'll call him Kofi because that's not his name, but his story is real and it belongs to thousands of you watching this right now. Kofi is 24. He grew up in Accra, smart, genuinely uncomfortably smart, the kind of smart where teachers noticed, where his mother told her friends about him. He wanted to build something in fintech. He had a real idea, a real gap in the market. He'd thought about it for 2 years, and every single evening after coming home from a job that was slowly killing his soul, Kofi would tell himself, "Tonight, I'll work on the idea. Tonight, I'll build the prototype. Tonight, I'll research the market. Tonight is the night." And then he'd lie down, just for a minute, just to decompress, and he'd open his phone. 3 hours later, he hadn't built anything. He'd watched strangers argue on Twitter, seen 15 people's highlight reels on Instagram, laughed at 47 videos on TikTok, and now it was midnight and he was exhausted and vaguely ashamed, and the idea was still waiting. This went on for 18 months. Here's what Kofi thought was happening. He thought he lacked discipline. He thought he was lazy. He thought maybe he just wasn't built for this. He started to believe the worst story you can tell yourself, which is that the gap between you and your potential is a character flaw. But here's what was actually happening. Kofi's dopamine system had been so thoroughly colonized by the variable reward schedule of his phone that the experience of opening a code editor where nothing would happen but with his own effort, where there was no immediate feedback, where reward was distant and uncertain, that experience had become neurologically indistinguishable from pain. He wasn't lazy, he was neurologically trapped. And the cruelest part, the platforms were making money from his stagnation. Every hour Kofi spent not building his dream, he spent building someone else's advertising revenue. Let's get specific about the mechanism, because understanding this is what gives you power over it. In his landmark book, Dopamine Nation, Stanford addiction psychiatrist Dr. Anna Lembke describes what she calls the dopamine deficit state. Here's how it works. Your brain is always trying to maintain balance, what scientists call homeostasis. When you do something that spikes your dopamine, your brain compensates by suppressing dopamine below your normal baseline. This is why every high comes with a come down, every binge with a crash, every hour of scroll with that hollow, slightly depressed feeling after.
But here's what Lemke found in her clinical work with thousands of patients. When people repeatedly spike their dopamine with easy, high-stimulation sources, the baseline itself drops. Your new normal becomes lower. And when your baseline is lower, everything that used to feel okay now feels flat. Hard work, which used to feel meaningful, now feels pointless. Delayed gratification, which used to feel like discipline, now feels impossible. You haven't become weaker. Your neurochemistry has been altered. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because the implication is enormous. The reason so many young African men feel stuck isn't primarily about opportunity. It's not primarily about access. It's about the fact that the very neural hardware you need to pursue opportunity, the dopamine pathways that make hard work feel worth it, have been quietly degraded by the thing you spend 6 hours staring at. Now, let's talk about why this hits differently here, why I'm making this specific to African men and not just young people broadly. Because I think you already know somewhere in your bones that the stakes are different for you. If a 22-year-old in San Francisco falls into a dopamine trap for 2 years, he has a safety net, a family with assets, a credential from a university that opens doors,
A system designed with a degree of tolerance for delay. He can recover. If you waste your most productive years, your highest energy, highest neuroplasticity years, your mid-20s, the window when the neural pathways for mastery and expertise are most easily built, if you spend those years pressing a lever, the cost is not just personal, it is generational. Because you are not just building for yourself, you never were. The wealth your generation creates or fails to create will determine whether your children are born into inheritance or debt, whether your community has institutions or continues borrowing them, whether Africa in 2050 looks like a continent that seized its moment or one that watched it pass by on a screen. I don't say this to scare you. I say this because I think you're someone who can handle the truth. And more than that, I think you're someone who actually cares about more than just yourself. And if you're watching a channel called The Science of Ambition, you already know that what you do with your time matters more than most people around you are willing to admit. So what do? Because this is not a documentary about despair. This is about understanding your enemy well enough to beat it. Here's the first thing. Stop calling it a discipline problem. Seriously, stop. Because when you frame it as discipline, you fight yourself. You try harder, you fail again, you feel worse, your self-concept erodes, and paradoxically, you become even less capable of doing the hard thing. The research on this is clear. Self-blame does not produce change. Understanding the mechanism does. When Kofi finally understood that he wasn't broken, that he had been systematically manipulated by a system with billions of dollars and teams of the world's smartest engineers working to exploit his biology, something shifted. He stopped fighting his willpower and started fighting the system. Those are completely different battles. Here's the second thing. The same dopamine system that was used against you can be used for you, because the dopamine system doesn't only respond to cheap stimulation, it also responds to what neuroscientist Andrew Huberman describes as effort-based rewards. When you do hard things and complete them, especially things with uncertain outcomes, your brain learns to associate effort with dopamine release. This is the biology of ambition, and it can be rebuilt. But here's the key, and this is the thing most productivity advice misses completely. You cannot rebuild it while the cheap alternative is always available. You can't rewire your wanting system if every time the hard thing gets uncomfortable, the phone is right there, ready to give you 200 easier dopamine hits per minute. This is why the most important move isn't adding habits, it's removing access. It's deliberately making the cheap lever harder to press, so that when the wanting fires, the only available target is the thing you're trying to build. Kofi didn't develop superhuman willpower. He put his phone in a drawer across the room and charged it in the kitchen at night. He used an app blocker with a time delay he couldn't override in the moment. He created what psychologist Roy Baumeister calls commitment devices, external structures that make the default behavior the right one.
Within 3 months, he had a working prototype. Not because he became a different person, because he changed the environment and let his biology do the rest. The third thing is about identity, and this might be the most important thing I say in this entire video. The dopamine trap is not just a habit, it's a story. The story of a person who consumes rather than creates. A person who watches other people's lives rather than builds their own. And stories are self-fulfilling in a way that's deeply neurological. What you believe you are determines what actions feel natural to you and what actions feel like swimming upstream. In his book, Atomic Habits, James Clear talks about identity-based change as the deepest level of behavioral change. Not changing what you do, but changing who you believe you are. And there's a reason this resonates, because when your identity is "I'm building something," the phone becomes a distraction from who you are. When your identity is "I'm someone who scrolls," the hard work feels like the interruption. This is the question I want to leave you with, not as a rhetorical trick, but as something to genuinely wrestle with. Who are you when nobody's watching? When the feed is closed and the notifications are off, and it's just you and the blank page, or the empty spreadsheet, or the idea that's been living in your chest for 2 years, what do you do? Because that answer, that specific answer, is your real life. Everything else is just content. There's a generation of young African men right now at a crossroads so significant that people 50 years from now will look back at it and shake their heads. Not because the challenges were too great. The challenges have always been great, but because for the first time in history, the people with the most to build also had access to an infinitely entertaining mechanism specifically engineered to make sure they never built it. The continent is not waiting for permission from the outside world anymore. The capital is forming, the infrastructure is growing, the ideas are real, and they're yours. The diaspora is sending back more than money. It's sending back frameworks and networks and proof that it's possible. But none of that matters if the people who are supposed to build it are spending their fire pressing a lever. You already know this. You felt it before you clicked on this video. That uncomfortable awareness of time passing, of capability unused, of a life deferred. That's not anxiety. That's your ambition trying to wake you up. The question is whether you're going to keep numbing it or whether you're going to let it mean something. Kofi shipped his product 4 months ago. It has 800 users. It's not a success story yet, but he's in the game. He made the choice to stop consuming his own potential and start building with it. That choice is available to you right now. Not tomorrow, not after one more video, not after you finish the feed. Right now. If this cracked something open for you, if some part of this felt true in a way that's uncomfortable, then do one thing before you scroll again. Leave a comment with just one word, what you're building. Not because I need to know, because saying it out loud is the first act of treating it as real. And if you want to go deeper on how ambitious Africans are rewiring their minds and building in spite of every system designed to distract them, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel exists for. The work is waiting, and so are you.